over. We've got time to do that next week as we'll continue to talk about the conversation of creation and evolution in a little bit. A reminder of what we're looking to do in this class is we're looking to kind of answer these questions of why do we believe in God? Why do we believe that the Bible is God's word? And why do we believe that Jesus is God's son? And as we look to answer those big three questions, that probably helps fit in line our worldview for how we're thinking about the rest of our lives as well. So as we look at the evidence for these things, we need to recognize, what do we have? Are we making claims that God exists, but there really isn't evidence in that direction? Or are we making claims about the Bible that aren't substantial and true? Or do we see reasons to say evidence is pointing to this actually exists, or this evidence actually exists? From there, how do we understand that evidence? What's the best explanation of seeing either fossils or genetics or seeing mutations or looking into space? I'm talking about some of those things, and we'll hit just a few of those today. And then ultimately, even as we think about the evidence and know what we have, it comes to a choice of what do I do with that evidence? And that's a big theme today and next week, as we'll look at the evidence that we have and then what do we do with that evidence as well. Barrett, your family feeling a little bit better? I don't mean to call you out from that regard. Going to get you to lead our opening prayer as we get started today. We'll be thinking about these things. Let's start with a word of prayer. Brother?
Our God and Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day to come here, this group of Christians to live and worship in this place, so that we can come together, study from your word, learn things to know more about you and how you have us to live. We pray that you would be with Jeff and the other Bible class teachers this morning as they go through the materials and read the scriptures and comment on it, and so we can learn it and understand it and be able to apply it. Be with us during this hour and in the worship hour. We may focus on you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Just a second. Today, in this particular class, we're hoping to hit these objectives or make you focus on these ideas. We want to discuss this morning the possibilities of the origin of matter. See, when we think about everything that the world is made of and matter and these different materials, where did all of that come from? Exploring some of that, even as we talked about that a little bit already. We want to define the term evolution and think about how we'll be using that phrase in class today and how people will think about that phrase some. And seeing from that some cases that evolutionists might make, some key ideas either that they're using or maybe some responses that we can use in response to their responses. And then finally summarize what we believe and understand the Bible teaches about the origins of matter and life. And that I think it'll be helpful for us to do a little bit of review from some of our previous classes. Maybe you haven't been in some of our classes before. Maybe we just need to remind ourselves of some things quickly as we're thinking about evidences, as we're thinking about defending the faith. Let's go ahead. It's not on the screen, but let's get for a moment 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 has been kind of a key verse we've been coming back to throughout these classes. 1 Peter chapter 3, this is verse 15. I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible for our class this hour. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. But in your hearts regard Christ the Lord as holy, ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do this with gentleness and reverence, keeping a clear conscience so that when you are accursed, those who disparage your good conduct in Christ will be put to shame. We need to be ready here, as it says, to give a defense or to give an answer for the reason of the hope within us. As we want to give a reason for the hope that we have, a lot that's connected to the faith that we have in God and in His Word and in His Son, Jesus. That means as we think about faith, one definition of faith, maybe there's other ways we could talk about this too, and maybe you're thinking in your mind Hebrews 11 already a little bit. We won't go there this morning, but you might be thinking about that. Faith is a reasonable conclusion that's based on observable evidence leading to a belief in something that is unseen. People put faith in things. They come to reasonable conclusions about where the evidence is pushing them or pointing them in all types of things, not just when it comes to religion, but even in science as well. There are some things that scientists believe to be true, even though they've not observed these physical things to have happened yet. I haven't seen this event. I haven't seen this take place, but there's lots of evidence in their opinion that's pointing them towards accepting a theory or living their lives and thinking that this theory is in truth with how the world works or operates. And so there is this sense of faith in regard to that. A little bit on the other side of that, well, I guess I say the other side, I just mean the other end of maybe a spectrum here, or a way to measure some a little bit. Doubt being talked about this way of uncertainty about what or why you believe based on factors such as reason or motion or experience. I ask you, what do you believe? And you might say, I'm a Christian, so I believe that God exists. I believe he created the universe. I believe that the Bible is his word. That is his word. I believe that Jesus is his son who died on the cross for our sins and who rose from the tomb, has all authority on heaven and on earth. And I say, okay, explain that. What do you mean by that? And maybe there's a little bit of, you're trying to struggle how to put that into words. Or maybe there's something of, why do you believe that? And you're trying to understand for yourself. I believe that because that's just how I grew up. That's how I was raised. That's because it's comfortable with the way I live my life and it helps me to live my life well. Or just some other reasons or conclusions I've come to on my own. Whatever that distance is between what it is and what you believe and maybe this uncertainty in that regard, that would be a place of doubt that is keeping you from that perfect faith. Doubt is not a problem. It shouldn't be a problem in the life of a Christian as long as we continue to grow in our knowledge and grow in study and grow in our trust in God and seeing him as the source of those things. But when we have that doubt, we try to say, what do we do with that? Rather than moving that us away from God, can we find something that helps us to move us towards God in that regard? When we think about these conversations too, another idea is going to be thinking about our presuppositions, a belief that's assumed true from the beginning, before even looking at the evidence and reasoning through something. This is our starting point. And so, being very honest and clear as we're in a Bible class, as we're talking about God, as we're talking about creation and evolution some this morning and points for or against one or the other, be very upfront that we believe in God. We believe he created all things. We believe the Bible is true in his word. We believe probably that bottom bullet point up there, supernaturalism, the belief that something exists outside of nature and the universe is dependent on something else to create and to sustain it. Something else needs to be holding all this together. Something else had to bring all this into existence. And I think we're going to make some cases for that even this morning. Something outside of matter, outside of what we can observe physically in this universe. Another starting point would be, rather than supernaturalism, would be naturalism. The idea that the belief of nature is all there is. The matter that we see in space, the matter we don't see in space, the dust, the stars, the heat, the energy, is all that we find and all that we know that we can see from those observable senses. And there's nothing outside of that, because the universe just simply relies on itself. We're going to start somewhere within probably those two spectrums of things. We're either supernaturalists, believing that supernatural events can take place outside of the universe, or we're naturalists, thinking that only the universe exists and that's all that there is. There's nothing beyond what we find. And we need to be honest about that. We need to know what our starting point is and recognize that we talk about these things this morning of where matter comes from and where life comes from. What is our presupposition? So when we come to thinking about creation and evolution, we use phrases like creation versus evolution. The debate is not really about the Bible versus science. Maybe you've heard those conversations before, for people to say that science and the Bible are incompatible. If you're a person of faith, then you can't be a person who truly believes in science and the scientific method. You might be somebody who, as a Christian, say, I can't trust in science because I believe in the Bible and I don't have to look at evidence or reason. I just blindly trust in things. That's not really the conversation, the debate we're looking to consider or think about this morning, of the Bible versus science. I think those two things can coexist and should coexist. And many people who have faith in God have been also people who have gone through the studies of sciences in order to prove the existence of God or try to prove the existence of God and give evidences for that. Both sides are looking at the same data when it comes to people of faith and people who rely solely on science, people who are on science. The supernaturalistic view and the naturalistic view, both people are looking at the same evidence, the same data. And it's not really the data that's in dispute. It's not like that one person is saying, here's a piece of data, and another group is saying, no, that data isn't even there. We all recognize and see the data and the evidence is in front of us, just like we saw. We want to know what evidence we have, but then the question is, how do we interpret that evidence? What do we do with that evidence? How are we reasoning and thinking about that? Appreciate this quote that I saw. We believe that God created matter and life. Evolutionists believe that these were formed through a process of random chance. Both are positions of faith, and the question for us to consider is which one is more reasonable. Hopefully that's a good reminder for us to see and to understand that the view of evolutionists that just over a lot of time and chance, things came together for the universe to exist, and particularly for our earth to be formed in a place that allowed for life to exist, and maybe that's happening in other universes as well. There's also the type of faith that's needed for a creationist or for someone who believes in God to say, I believe that evidence points to God being behind all of this. So how do we use the evidence this morning? How do we think about that evidence? That's the question we want to consider. Finally, is in the form of review, two of the arguments we've been using for the existence of God that we've kind of talked about briefly in certain ways we want to talk about more and think about over these next few weeks. The cosmological argument, that there's a first cause. We're familiar with cause and effect. If I put baking powder in vinegar or baking soda in vinegar, you're going to get that cool, bubbly, old-school science class volcano project. If I take my son's toy away while he's in the middle of playing it, the cause leads to the effect of him crying and breaking down. Or when my son cries and breaks down, then I start to cry and break down. There's cause and effect that keeps happening. There's cause and effect throughout the universe. So the effect is stuff is here. So what was the cause that led to that? The cosmological argument says that God is that first cause who is the uncaused cause. We believe that God is that uncaused cause that brought the universe into being, that he himself does not abide by those same rules that we see in this universe because he is outside of that universe. Along with that is the teleological argument, the evidence of a complex design within various parts of the universe, from the stars to the human body to simple cells and DNA, pointing to an intelligent designer behind everything. We think about parts of life. You think about a computer program. You think about a bench. You think about somebody who makes art or who makes a meal of some kind. Somebody's behind putting those things together, putting those things into being. So who is behind all that when it comes to all of this in the universe? Is there a designer, or is it just random chance that has led to these things? Has it just been science and nature happening over thousands and millions and billions of years leading to these points? So keeping those ideas in mind, we're going to let Patrick make a quick comment, then we're going to get into the main focus of our class today. Yes, sir.
Just kind of in keeping with that is that idea that why is there anything? Which is something that, because I studied science for quite a bit. I mean, tried to get a degree in biology on the idea, but anyway, that's the question that really science can't answer. And that's part of the issue that we get into when we get into cosmological and teleological arguments, is it fundamentally comes back to it's great to know how everything works, and maybe even why it's the way it is now. But the big question is why is there anything?
Right.
Right? And you can't just by science come up with an answer for that, right?
Yeah.
Science can start with things and tell you what they look like after that, but explaining why there's anything at all, why in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, is something that just plain old science can't do, right?
That's right.
It's one thing to talk about why something becomes something else, but dealing with why there's anything to start with, it's not there. And so no matter which side we're on, we're dealing with faith.
We're having to deal with that question, what those big questions that, it might not be big in just how many words it is, but it's one of those questions you can sit and ponder. And again, without God in the picture, that comes a lot of, well, I see this, and so I'm going to try to jump to this conclusion in that regard. And people try to back up how they get from point A to point B in that. But it's that question of why is there anything? Not why is there life on earth, but just anything at all comes to these questions we're trying to think about today. Does evolution point towards that? What cases are they making in that? Does Scripture point towards that? That starts with really the idea of the cosmological argument and just matter. Where does matter come from? These four possibilities, and maybe there's more, have been presented and I think are helpful for us to begin with. The idea of it's all just an illusion, that Tracy, you're not really here today because you're not really real, and I'm not really real. I think, and this is the parentheses up there is my understanding, kind of, I've heard this in some ways before. This might not be exactly what that is, and so if it is, then I'll have to change my wording on that. And if we're all living in a computer simulation, you heard that before. Well, yeah, it's all the Matrix, if you're familiar with that idea. And either you're all plugged in at the same time with me, or it's literally just I'm imagining all of you because something is plugging me into that system. It's one of those of, it sounds like a cool movie, but I don't think it really helps us explain the question of why is there anything at all. There's the idea that it just spontaneously arose out of nothing. The thought that from what we know about how things coming to be and how things work in the universe, at some point there must have been nothing and then something came from that. We'll look at that a little bit in just a moment. Also thinking about number 3, it had no origin, but matter just existed eternally. Not calling it God in that regard, but we think about describing God as being eternal, that making him different and unique from the world. But some people might say, well, this matter must have just been around for a long time. And so that's why there's things that are the way that they are, because it's just always been here and always been that way. Maybe things ebb and flow on some large cycle, but here we are. Or it was created. The idea that something made all this happen, that something brought all of this into being. There are a couple of parts to go with that, and thinking about this, look at 2 laws of physics and a law of biology this morning, looking to get into some of that science stuff. Maybe you've heard of thermodynamics. You've heard of that from some of your physics classes that were just yesterday or maybe a couple years ago for some of us. But we think about this idea that the law of energy conservation, that matter cannot be created or destroyed. So according to this law, it's impossible for matter to be eternal. From what we know about matter, that's always existed, or if someone says it's always been here, when we look at matter, that doesn't stick to that say that matter can't be created in that regard. Something must have created that matter in the first place when we understand with this particular law. That goes to some of these places we're familiar with, like Genesis 1. I want to particularly notice not just how the law of thermodynamics, this first law here, doesn't point to the creation of matter, but also the sustaining of matter. And when we talk about matter existing, and not just God creating the universe, but also notice, as we'll get in a little bit, as you're turning to Genesis 1 right now, and I'm turning to Genesis 1 right now, we'll get to passages that show us that God is sustaining the universe as well. I'm going to go and get Genesis 1 for us. Can I get a volunteer ready for Genesis 2, 2 and 3 in just a moment? Genesis 2 and 3. All right, Austin, in just a second, let's get Genesis 1:1 together to get the baseline of what we're talking about. According to the first law of thermodynamics, matter isn't created or destroyed according to the law of science that we can observe in our universe, but there must have been something before that happened in order for matter to come into existence. Our position would be Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything you would read following Genesis chapter 1 as well. Austin, can you read Genesis 2 and 3 for us, please?
And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God created and made.
So God created all things. That's the point that we're looking to notice here. And he rests from that creation of bringing everything into the universe. From there, places like Colossians chapter 1, as well as Hebrews chapter 1. We'll just grab Colossians chapter 1 for this morning. This is Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 and verse 17. Tracy, can I get you to do Colossians 1, 16 and 17 for us? Notice what it says about how Jesus was there at creation. It is through Jesus all things were made, but not just that through him all things are sustained as well. Tracy, whenever you're ready, Colossians 1, 16 and 17.
1 verse 16, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. and he is before all things, and in him all things consist.
All things consist. Some of your versions might say all things hold together. It is by the power of Jesus that things even just continue to run and operate the way that they do. And without him, my body just literally explodes, and your body explodes, and the whole building, everything just starts falling apart. There's Jesus who's keeping all of our atoms, everything together within our universe, because he is the one who's brought all this into existence and continues to sustain that as well. We continue to think about the origins of matter. There's the second law of thermodynamics, this idea that the law of entropy is something we can observe in our universe. Entropy being energy deterioration or disorder or decay. Things are leading towards, maybe you've heard the word randomness, but don't think necessarily so much of just it's completely out of our control or guessing, but things are leading towards breaking down. We see things breaking down all around us. Our cell phones, eventually, Apple comes up with a new update, and around September, October, my phone starts running slower than it used to because they're trying to push the new phone. And even eventually, at some point, this isn't going to last forever. The battery's going to die. Our clothes wear out eventually. Our cars wear out eventually. I've heard from multiple of our senior saints who talked about how just wonderfully pleasant it is growing older and how everything gets so much easier and smoother, right? Maybe especially as you get upgrades and you get closer to the $6 million man with new knees or hips or something like that. We know our bodies break down too. That's something we just observe in the universe, that things aren't coming together, things are leading towards disorder and decay, that maybe there would be a starting point. And even Scripture points to that idea of there being the fact that the universe is wearing down and decaying. We see these passages here, Isaiah 51 and verse 6. Well, I'm grabbing Isaiah 51, 6. If someone can get ready in Psalm 102 as well. We'll be in Psalm 102, 25 and 27. Let's begin with Isaiah 51 and verse 6. I'll read that for us. Isaiah 51 and verse 6. Look up to the heavens and look at the earth beneath. For the heavens will vanish like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment, its inhabitants will die like gnats. But my salvation will last forever, and my righteousness will never be shattered. There's a contrast between the universe that we observe and see that is breaking down, deteriorating, and God himself. That's brought out more here in Psalm 102. Who has Psalm 102? Becca, if you mind reading Psalm 102, 25 and 27 for us.
Of old thou didst found the earth, and the heavens are the work of thy hands. Even they will perish, but thou dost endure, and all of them will wear out like a garment. Like clothing, thou wilt change them, and they will be changed. But thou art the same, and thy years will not come to an end.
Thank you very much. You see, and here, again, the contrast between the universe, it's going to wear out like garments. We're familiar with that because we've seen that. And the psalmist is making that point here, that the universe will eventually one day come to an end. But the difference is that God is eternal, and he lasts forever. He's different from what we see, the matter that he has made and brought into existence. Finally, kind of bridging the gap between our points today of wanting to recognize where the origin of matter comes from. It doesn't seem to be that it's coming from just a simulation. It's not just the Matrix. It doesn't seem like it's always been around, and it doesn't seem like it just came out of nothing. Moving a little bit from the origin of matter to the origin of life. The law of biogenesis makes the point that life comes from existing life, and even from that of its own kind as well. There's yet to be any type of evidence discovered of spontaneous generation. That's often talked about, the idea that everything just came into existence from spontaneous being, just something there was nothing, and all of a sudden, boom, everything started to exist. Maybe it was an explosion, a bang of some kind that brought all of the energy into the world, and it's now kind of radiating off of that. But something brought all of this to be here, and that life even came into that way, came into being like that as well. You see this diagram up here of Louis Pasteur, an example of an experiment he did in 1859. And the top picture, you see him boiling a broth in this curved-necked kind of bottle. And with that, you get all of the bacteria, all the microbes out of this broth, and then let it sit for months, for days, or for years. And from that, never saw life come into existence. There would be microbes that would come in with dust, but they would get stuck at the very bottom of the long, curved neck. And so from there, you never saw anything coming of microbes or bacteria starting to exist within the bottle. Now, if he broke off that neck, as he did in some other parts of the experiment to get some control and to see what would happen if he exposes it to air, all of a sudden the broth starts to change because you get some of that coming into being. But just left undone, you're not seeing time bringing life into existence just out of nowhere. I mean, the point might be that the possibility could be there if you give it enough time. If you give it thousands of years, if you give it millions of years, if you give it billions even of years, maybe eventually life would come into existence, right? Possibly. There's a lot of, it'd be chance, it'd be maybes, possibles in that regard, with enough time, with enough opportunity, and just kind of a hope and a wish in that regard, a lot like faith that would happen. It's getting a little bit away from life, but maybe you've heard before the example of if you give enough monkeys enough time with enough typewriters that eventually somehow they'll they'll type out the complete works of Shakespeare. The thought of, if you just give them enough time, eventually that would happen to be. I don't know that it would be you train them, but just the thought of they just randomly are smashing buttons. At some point, there's going to be a sequence of that coming into existence and to that being there. There's a lot of possibility. There's a lot of chance. There's a lot of randomness that has to go into that place, though, rather than the idea that there's an intelligent thought behind all of that, of bringing matter into existence and operating according to certain laws that say more matter can't be created or destroyed, or that matter is going to be in this constant state of decay, is not meant to last forever, or that life was not meant to just come out of nothing, but life has a purpose. Genesis 1, verse 20 through verse 25. We'll be back in Genesis again, coming to Genesis a couple of times today. Genesis 1, 20 through 25. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 21, I want you to notice is when God is creating the different animals, the animals in the air, the animals in the sea, the animals on land, everything is made in its own kind. And then from there, you'll get to notice even later, we won't go there, but in Genesis chapter 2, things continue to follow that pattern of its own kind. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, God said, "Let the waters swarm with living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the large sea creatures and every living creature that moves and swarms in the water according to their kinds. He also created every winged creature according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them. "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And evening came, and then morning, the fifth day. Verse 24, God said, "Let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and wildlife, the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. God made the wildlife on the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, all the creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Kind of even going back from the point of life existing because God brought that into existence, and it follows after its kind then. That life does not arise out of nothing. Life does not arise out of non-existent life. The idea that something does not exist, that this water bottle is not going to turn into a fish someday, is this idea of the law of biogenesis, that life comes from existing life. That it would take something else that lives in water and some type of creature in that kind to produce creatures of that kind. A little bit going back to Patrick's point from earlier, though, why do things exist? Genesis 1 starts to get to that answer of why things exist, not just because God made it, but also a little bit of why do we exist. A whole class could move on for the rest of the 20 minutes and the rest of the sessions for the next few weeks with Genesis 1, 26 and 27. God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, all the creatures that crawl on the earth." God created man in his own image. He created them in the image of God. He created them male and female. Why does life exist? Because God created us to bear his image and to have a purpose to rule his creation and to take care of his stuff and to do his work, as I heard one person summarize this idea. Now, how do we know what is his stuff that he wants us to take care of? We read about that in Scripture. What is the work he has for us to do? He tells us in Scripture. That's how we come to know what he is. But that gets us to some of the answers. One possibility, the answer of why we are even here at all, to honor God, to bear his image, and to bring glory to him as we worship him not just on days like today, but every day of our lives. When we think about the origin of matter and beginnings of the origin of life, people will make the case of it just came out of nothing, or that it just kind of evolved over millions and millions of years, and things eventually changed into what it was, or this idea that it's just always been around, it's always existed, or we can make the case that it's created. And the question for us is to sit and ponder some of these things, again, as we're just briefly talking about them this morning, of what makes the most sense, what's most reasonable that we should follow then and trust and go along with. Does it show that God created these things, or that these things came in time and chance? And if it's God, there'll be some things we have to follow up with in that regard that we'll follow up with class of what does that mean for us then as well. Before I get farther, am I being clear? Questions, comments? One, to make sure that we get an understanding of where the origins of matter and life come from. Jeff, go ahead.
In graduate school, one of the books we read was called The Origins of Unbelief in America, and it was very enlightening. The original atheists were super religious Harvard types who had decided that they were better than God. That it kind of started with the anti-slavery movement, and the Southerners who were defending slavery kept pointing to things in the Bible that didn't condemn slavery, and they said, well, if the Bible doesn't condemn slavery, then I condemn the Bible. And then they took that and started running with the idea that God wasn't up to their standards. They didn't like his moral compass, they didn't like anything about him, and so they just decided he didn't exist.
Right.
And when you go back, like, one verse that's always stuck out to me, Isaiah 65:5. Stand by thyself, come not near me, for I am holier than thou. That was what the people of Israel said to God. You're not as good as me, so go away. And when people are saying they don't believe in God, or there have to be all these crazy ideas for how things came to be, really they just don't want the God that's in the Bible. They don't like the fact that he won't let them do what they want to. And if you won't let me do what I want, then you just don't exist for me.
Yeah.
And then they create all their own gods that will let them do whatever they want to do.
We made an observation from that last week in our class of a lot of people and the objections they have to God. A lot of times it's going to boil down to that idea. Maybe sometimes people will very readily admit it. Maybe sometimes that's kind of they play the cards close to their chest. But especially things like that of if you throw out the Word of God, it's not long until you're throwing out God himself, or God's not the picture of I want him to be like you said, and so God must not really be there. But the question isn't, does God fit with my mold? It's the question of, am I willing to listen to God say who he is and accept that, and then respond with what he wants me to do in appropriation to that regard. So as we're thinking about these things, it's those heavy questions of, well, is there something behind all of this? If there is, who is that? What does that mean? If it's gods who are just as flawed as I am, then yeah, let them do their stuff and I'll just keep doing my thing. But if it's a God who is powerful and mighty and good and just and holy and calls me to repentance and change and to be like him, and then there might be some times of rub, and sometimes that rub needs to denying him. Sometimes that rub needs us to accepting him and willing to be submissive and to be holy, or to be humble as we approach him then. But the question is, what do we do with the evidence that's pointing us in sometimes those two different directions? And really the evidence isn't pointing there, it's people who are interpreting that evidence. And again, we want to be very clear that our belief and our understanding is that it's God who's behind all of this, and that we want to push people to him and to know him. People who think differently, how can we have conversations to try to build the bridges that will help point them to God then, or help them reach him as well? And that leads us to, in the next couple of minutes, thinking about evolution and thinking about one response to how all this came into being is that things evolved over time. A simple definition of evolution might be the theory of evolution. Well, that's not a great way to start a quote, is by saying the first part of the quote. Let me start that over. The theory of evolution may be defined as the hypothesis that millions of years ago, lifeless matter acted upon by natural forces gave origin to one or more minute living organisms, which have since evolved into all living, and extinct plants and animals, including man. So you notice a couple of things up there. Number one, there's a time-related aspect that millions of years ago, and notice this, lifeless matter. Not that there was some type of life, but there was lifeless matter. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about soup or goo, and that goo kind of eventually turning into a simple cell, and that simple cell being something that led into a common ancestor where all things can trace back to that one first life being that came from non-existent life in this thought. And then from there, everything that's either still living today, everything that has lived and has gone extinct since then has come from that one source of life in the very beginning of evolution. I guess not the very beginning, but whenever that time arose, that life first came into being. Simply put, this is how naturalists would explain life coming into the world. The idea that there is no supernatural, there is no God beyond this universe who could bring this into being, there is no uncaused cause, and so at some point there must have been a cause that led to life existing, so non-life material came into life. Through some type of forces that we can speculate about, that we can try to evidence or try to come to reason with based on things we see today and try to think about what's happened then, but we haven't seen that happen before, of non-existent life bringing life, or lifeless matter bringing life matter in that regard. That's kind of the base idea here. You're probably familiar with at least the name of this guy or this particular person and his finches, and Charles Darwin, and how he thought about evolution. Part of why he came to the conclusion he did that there must be a common ancestor and there must be evolution that's changed over the years. The idea of, well, finches in one part of the world have different types of beaks than finches in other parts of the world. They use their beaks differently, and so they've adapted, they've evolved, they've changed. We might call this microevolution, that there are some small changes within a group. You think about different types of bears or tigers or animals or even people who adapt to their surroundings by small things changing. The color of fur of an animal adapting or changing, or the type of the length of a body, or different parts of a body like a beak or wingspan, or those types of things adapting and changing to how they need to use that. Do they need to break it open some type of food source that's different than food sources in other parts of the world, even though they might both be birds, they might even be from the same family of birds? Are they different in that regard? Well, there might be some small changes that take place within a group of animals then, still happening just within tigers or just within finches. But the idea that Darwin is kind of proposing is this thought of macroevolution. There's large changes from one group to another. The idea that you start with some type of probably a water creature, that eventually it grows legs and come onto land, and then that turned into some type of dinosaur, and that dinosaur turned into a bird, which turned into a chicken. And so when you look at a lizard and you look at a chicken, you would find these two are very similar to one another in that regard. The idea of one thing changing from one piece of life to another. And at some point, there was a branch that came from one of those leading towards dinosaurs and reptiles and birds and sea creatures to some type of primate type of animal that leads to eventually our previous ancestors and then to us today. This idea that within different groups of animals, there are these very large changes happening. And so the evidence of microevolution happening, that small changes within a group of animals, for Darwin seeing that, said, well, then macroevolution could be possible or must be possible then for how we came to why is there anything at all? Or maybe more particularly a little bit more refined of why is there life and why is life the way that it is. But evidence of microevolution does not require that macroevolution. There's a giant leap that one must take to go from the micro of small changes in one group of animals to the macro then large changes happening to lead to other different types of creatures and animals. And hopefully we can recognize that there's a leap that takes place there. And probably even people who believe in evolution recognize, yes, there is a bit of a leap, but I'm willing to go with that leap for now and understand, I may not always see all the exact pieces in there, but that makes sense maybe at least in my mind. Before we go farther, I want to make sure we at least have that. The idea of evolution being over millions of years, a large change takes place from one type of creature to another type of creature. The difference between micro and macro evolutions, that makes sense. Any clarifications I need to do before we go? Jeff, go ahead.
Microevolution to me is survival of the fittest. Which,
Natural selection, some of that idea.
you can see that
That's right.
I mean, it's simple. You look at the way dog breeds and cattle breeds are created. People took them and they decided these are the traits we want, so those are the traits that we breed for. And people in different parts of the world, you know, like if you're gonna live in the Arctic Circle, you're gonna have more body fat. If you're living close to the equator, you're gonna have darker skin. I mean, it's just the way it is.
That's right. And so people might say, well, that's the way it is because nature has been pushing us in some direction to evolve and to change and to adapting to that. So is the question, is nature behind that? Is God behind that? Does the point to say that nature's behind that say that God's not in the equation at all and that some point, millions of years ago, we haven't found it exactly yet, but eventually maybe we'll find evidence of a link that goes from a simple creature to a more complex creature, or from one group of family of animals to another group of family of animals? We'll see. But the idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest, we see some of that within this microevolution. When we get that jump to macroevolution, that's where we start to really have some conflict and some disagreements with how we would approach this conversation. One thing that evolutionists might use, this idea of vestigial structures, this idea that snakes have a pelvic bone. So why do they have a pelvic bone? What's that all about? Christians have answers for that maybe too. On Genesis. You have humans with a tailbone. You see animals with tails, so maybe there was a common ancestor in that regard. Similar to snakes, whales have a pelvic bone in that regard. Other parts, like the appendix, kind of being this useless organ. We have wisdom teeth. Is that something that's left over from a previous generation of some type of part of evolution? Even the vestigial structures are not just appendages or parts of the body, but goosebumps are being thought of. Did goosebumps serve a purpose in before other than just my wife constantly telling me I'm cold all of the time? You know, is there something else that would help somebody with? Is that like, did it used to be spidey sense and help people know about danger? I don't know if anybody actually makes that case, but if you're a superhero fan, a lot of times Spider-Man's related in that regard. So these vestigial structures, though, you have these leftover parts almost. Sometimes they're described in that way. Point of, well, maybe there used to be a function for that, but evolution is kind of winding those things out, and they're no longer needed for what's to come. Well, one answer to that would be this quotation here. There's no evidence, or there are no evidences of transitional stages between functioning organs and useless organs. Then these so-called useless appendages would prove degeneration, not evolution. Evolution is the rise of new and different and functioning organs, not the wasting away of organs. So as you point to, somebody says, well, look at the appendix. There must have been some use for that in the past, but now it's dwindling, it's fading away. Evolution would think to the idea that, well, if we're becoming more complex, then something new would arise, not something being left over in that regard. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that somewhat clearly? Wade, go ahead.
Well, John, one of the big issues with evolution as a whole is the very first line of that whole paragraph up there. Just the first line, right?
The transitional stages.
No evidence of transitional stages.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you have evolution, doesn't matter if it's millions of years, 100 years, it doesn't matter. You would have transitional stages across the board. You don't start with one cell and now you have human. You have to have the whole gamut of transition.
Right.
It never goes from one and ends with another. Or evolution, if it was true, has stopped. It's one of the two.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So the argument makes no sense. Even to an evolutionist, if you get them to that point of understanding, you have no transitional stage that you can point to.
Absolutely. That's right.
If you can't point to it, how can you have it?
Mm-hmm. That's a big part of the conversation is, that missing link that people are looking for. We still haven't found that missing link. People keep holding out hope. Maybe it will someday. But even now, you're not seeing further links that seem to be trying to a part of that chain. I mean, we're probably all familiar with, here's a picture of some primeval creature down on all fours, and then it slowly starts to stand up. Then you get a human body, then you get like a football player, like somebody in the NFL who's like peak athleticism or something. Usually seems to be connected to that. I'm usually not the very end of that picture, I'll say that. You get that of one thing leading and changing, transitioning to the other. But we're not noticing that with things like this type of evidence from evolution. Similar to that would be, Cade, was that a hand? I'll get it in a second. We might get it in a second, I'll say that. Another part would be genetics, and there's mutations going on. I mean, in my head, this immediately lead into like X-Men realm of things. Someone is born and then all of a sudden they can bend metal like Magneto, or they're shooting lasers out of their eyes like Cyclops. That's not what geneticists are talking about in that regard. They're thinking of something changing within our genetics that allows us to adapt or to survive. That nature behind that natural selection is leading to this genetics and this mutation, bringing about new change. Okay, a couple of things with mutation there. 3 slides somewhat quickly in this regard. The fact that mutations are random. They're not something that's selected. There's no way to control mutations to make them produce characteristics which might be needed. Natural selection must simply take what comes with it. The idea that nature doesn't say, all right, I'm going to force this mutation. Mutations are accidents. They're something that just happen randomly in that regard. Nature isn't selecting at all. Nature is pressed into accepting whatever it is that appears. So if a mutation does take place, if all of a sudden you do have red-haired people or red-bearded people, then that's something that's coming to existence and that's sticking around, but that's something that it wasn't nature brought that into existence. That was something that happened and it continues to exist. That people looked at those red-haired people and thought, all right, I guess, we'll continue to bring life into this world. I'm not going to completely shun you out. So we're seeing that continuing, but the mutation was random. Nature didn't bring that into existence. Recognize that mutations are very rare, not common. The mathematical probability of getting a sequence of helpful genetic mutations or even simultaneous genetic mutations to happen to lead from one form of life to another form of life. And that's what we're really thinking about here. Mutations going from you have a frog and all of a sudden that's leading now into a bird. Enough mutations happen that now from kind of I guess frogs don't have scaly skin, but leading from whatever skin that they have to having feathers and living life in that way. And eventually that bird mutating to lead into some type of other creature like a cat. I don't know if that's exactly the points that they would try to make the evidence or the existence. But to get all that to happen at the same time is just astronomical. You'd be a 1 in 10 to the 28th power. If you remember that, that's 28 zeros after that. That's a large number. So if you divide that, that's a very small percentage in that regard. Hand? Second. One more. All right. Finally, with mutations, this idea that a good mutation is even less common. A good mutation is very, very rare. The great majority of mutations in life are harmful in some way. Is to be expected of effects of accidental occurrences. Maybe you've heard of people who are born with extra fingers or extra toes or other type of genetic deficiencies or genetic type of problems in their lives. And from that regard, that leads not to, I've got this extra finger and now I'm, a superhero in that regard. A lot of times these mutations take place in the lives of people as we see that, and it leads to harm, it leads to damage in that person's life in some way. And that needs to be addressed in order to not just because they look weird, but it's more of the thought of it's harmful to their body and to their health. Most mutants which arise in any organism are more or less disadvantageous than to their possessors than what would normally be present. I'm out of time, and so I'm going to catch Cade and Audrey after class. We'll pick up with the thoughts here of how we take all of this. I know that it's not good to start a class next week with conclusion, but we will start there and picking up, with the lack of transition, with the thoughts of where does origins of matter come from, what do we do with all that, how do we relate to that, what do we do with that information. So we'll pick up there in our class next week. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time today. We'll have about 10 minutes until our worship gets started.